Class. Continuing on with chapter 12, we discussed some of the basics of the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Now we're going to go into more detail in the structure um, of the brain. We've talked about the four major parts of the brain, the cerebrum, diencephalon, uh, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Now we're going to go into more detail in the brain, which is a very complex organ, many parts to it, does a lot as far as controlling different parts of the body, voluntary and involuntary, and plays a significant role in our homeostasis. All right, so let's talk about first the cerebrum, big part of the brain, responsible for higher mental functions. You're using your cerebrum right now as we speak. Remember that we have the gray matter, the unmyelinated soma cell bodies, as well as unmyelinated dendrites and unmyelinated axons on the outside, and then we have the myelinated axons, the white matter on the inside. But let's talk about its anatomy. We all know the brain to have these sort of like grooves in it. Looks sort of spongy almost. They have shallow grooves on the surface, which are called sulci. And then it also has these elevated ridges between these shallow grooves, gyri. Together, they increase the surface area of the brain. You don't have much space within your skull, so having that sort of folded looking structure on the surface increases the surface area. More brain can fit into your skull. We have these deep grooves, which we separate from the sulci. These deep grooves on the surface called fissures. The main one that we think of is the longitudinal fissure, which goes right down the center of the brain, separates, goes basically down the medial line of the brain, which separates your brain into your right and left cerebral hemispheres. And this is something you've probably seen. Maybe you didn't call it the longitudinal fissure, but I'm sure when you see it, you'll recognize it. You also have a cavity deep within each cerebral hemisphere. Right hemisphere surrounds the right lateral ventricle, left hemisphere, left lateral ventricle. All right, so looking at the brain, and we're going to dissect this even more, and hopefully you'll do the brain dissection, which is pretty cool. The brain is one of those organs that when we dissect it in class, it can be very eye-opening just to see how it's all put together. All right, so the longitudinal fissure is this sort of line straight down the middle, which divides your brain into the left and right hemispheres. The left and right hemispheres are connected though, right? So don't think that it's two separate sides of the brain that aren't connected to each other. They are connected to each other. And then we have the gyrus or gyri, you'll see, and the elevated ridges, and then the sulcus, central sulcus or the sulci, you'll see are the sort of similar to fissures, but we call them they're less pronounced in not as deep, less pronounced in the fissures, but they are in conjunction with the gyrus, the gyri, to form like this sort of wave-like structure. And you'll notice the lobes, we haven't gotten into that yet, but we divide the brain into lobes. So you'll see the frontal lobe, the parietal, the occipital. We're going to show you the different lobes of the brain coming up. 5 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital we just saw. Also towards the sort of on the side is temporal, and then we have the insula. So this is how we divide the the cerebrum, frontal lobe towards the front or in front of the central sulcus, parietal lobe posterior to the central sulcus. That's how we decide the frontal and the parietal. Temporal is inferior to this lateral fissure. And then we have occipital, which is the most posterior portion of the brain. So you see the different sections of the brain, different lobes of the brain. Notice you didn't see the insula. That's because it's kind of hidden. We'll talk about that. All right, so these are the lobes. Frontal lobe goes up into your central sulcus. Neurons are responsible for planning, executing movement, mental behaviors, mental functions such as behavior, conscience, personality. Parietal lobes, just posterior to the frontal lobe. Neurons responsible for processing, integrating sensory information, also functions in attention. Notice the different parts of the brain work in very specific areas. And notice even when we say frontal lobe, we're talking about both sides of the brain, the left and right hemispheres. Okay, so when you think of the lobe, don't just think of one side of the brain. The frontal lobe is both sides of the front, the anterior portion of the brain. Your temporal lobe, hearing, language. This is where we'll talk about the language. We have a special section on that where we talk about language, but hearing, language, memory, emotions. Occipital, that's probably one of the easiest ones to remember. It's related to vision. Ocular, occipital, all related to vision. And then the insulas are deep underneath the lateral fissures, currently thought to be involved in the functions related to taste and your internal organs. But we're going to see some overlap as we'll see other parts of the brain also relate to our internal organs. All right, so now if you were to pull away at that lateral fissure, open up the brain, you would see what we call the insula, the fifth lobe of the brain, of the cerebrum. Sorry, not of the brain, of the specifically of the cerebrum. Right? Oops, sorry. Try to move my picture a little bit. Now, gray matter is on the superficial. Remember, that's unmyelinated axons, unmyelinated dendrites, and soma cell bodies. The gray matter, the superficial portion of the brain, we call that the cerebral cortex. This is functionally the most complex part of cortex, which covers the underlying cerebral hemispheres. Okay, remember the cerebrum is divided into left and right hemispheres. So you have this gray matter on the surface that covers the underlying white matter in the cerebral hemisphere. The cerebral cortex is very complex. Most of the cerebral cortex is called neocortex. Has a huge surface area. Remember, it has those sulcus and gyrus, those like hills and valleys. All neurons in the cortex are interneurons. That means in the and specifically the cortex, neurons are interneurons. They're not sensing anything per se, and they're not sensory neurons, and they're not sensing anything, and they're not motor neurons, and they're not causing anything to move directly. They're interneurons, right? So they're processing. Functions of neocortex revolve around conscious processes, right? So there are motor neurons that are going to get signals from these neurons. There are sensory neurons that are sending signals to these neurons in the cerebral cortex. but the actual neurons in the cerebral cortex are interneurons. That means they're only processing information. Remember, your brain controls other things, that does a lot of processing. The neocortex, now we've already divided the brain into lobes, hemispheres, the cerebrum into lobes and hemispheres, but we also divide the neocortex into three areas: primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortices, and then association areas, right? And you may say, well, how can it be a motor cortex if it's an interneuron? Even though it's processing information, it helps your body to plan movement. It also helps your body to interpret sensory information, even though these are interneurons. They're not actually doing the sensing. They're not actually doing the movement, but they're helping the body plan to do and helping the body function in movement. Right, so your primary motor cortex plans and executes movements. Primary sensory cortices receive and process sensory inputs. You sense things from different parts of your peripheral nervous system and send that signal eventually to the cerebral cortex. And that's where we do the processing. What am I seeing? What am I touching? What am I smelling, tasting? And association areas integrate different types of information, right? We have to integrate, put pieces of information together to get a nice clear picture. Right, so how do we divide the cerebral cortex? And you'll see that we can, this is where it starts to get complicated in the brain. Right, we have what we call all different sections: prefrontal cortex, frontal eye field. That's where your eyes are processing information. Premotor cortex, primary motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, somatosensory association cortex. See all these different sections. Wernicke's area. This is when we talk about language and speaking. Auditory. This is where we're processing information on that we've sensed from our ears. Primary auditory cortex, temporal association cortex, Broca's area, right? So all these different regions, very important. Right, so your motor areas, mostly located in the frontal lobe, contain upper motor neurons, which are interneurons. Remember, interneurons that connect to other neurons. All right, not skeletal muscle. These are neurons that may send the signal for something to move, but they're sending the signal to other neurons for those neurons to then tell the muscle or tell the body to move in some way. Right, so this is your motor areas or your primary motor cortex, conscious planning of movement, as you saw here in primary motor cortex right there. Upper motor neurons of each cerebral hemisphere control motor activity of opposite side of body. So left controls the right, right controls the left. Movement requires input from many motor association areas. Right? So movement, you're working on different motor association areas of the brain, such as premotor cortex. Work with the primary motor cortex to help coordinate movements. You have motor association areas, unimodal areas involving planning, guidance, and coordination. You also have frontal eye fields, paired motor association areas involved in back and forth eye movements. Right, these are all in your motor areas of your cerebral cortex. You have sensory cortices. Two main somatosensory areas deal with temperature, touch, vibration, pressure, stretch, joint position. The primary somatosensory area, somatosensory area, association cortex. All right, so that's your primary somatosensory association cortex, this blue area, and then this like orange area in the back. Then you have special senses. We have a whole chapter on special senses, chapter 15, where in that chapter 15, we deal with this touch, vision, hearing, smell, and taste, these special senses, which have a unique area in the cortex, the top layer of the brain, that help integrate, help figure out, these special senses. All right. And these special senses areas are found in all lobes of the cortex except frontal lobe, primary visual cortex, also at posterior end of occipital lobe. We talked about occipital lobe dealing with the vision. First area to process visual input. Processes color, movement, depth. Brain is complex. And more on the special senses, you have the auditory cortex, first to receive auditory information, gustatory cortex, taste, vestibular areas, your equilibrium, positional sensation, your olfactory cortex, your sense of smell, right? So these different regions process these different senses, sensory informations, process these different kinds of sensory information that are coming into the brain. So that's the drawing again, showing different cortices. We also have multimodal association areas, complex mental functions. And I mentioned this language processed in two areas of the cortex, Broca's area, which is in the premotor area. That's where we produce our speech and our speech sounds. And we have Wernicke's area and temporal and parietal lobes, the ability to understand language. So being able to actually, if you ever notice, there are people who can hear and understand, but who can't speak. There's two different parts of your brain working. So the part of your brain that speaks and your part of your brain that processes being able to hear the words that people are saying, there's two different parts of the brain. So you can be able to hear and understand what someone's saying without being able to physically speak, and vice versa, right? Prefrontal cortex occupies most of the frontal lobe, communicates with the diencephalon. Association area is located in other lobes. Cues modulating behavior, personality, learning, memory. That's in your prefrontal cortex in the front of your brain. That's why if you have an injury to the front of your head, it can really affect your personality. You can have memory loss, things like that. Parietal and temporal association areas. Multiple functions include integration of sensory information. As we said, language, that's in that Wernicke's area. Maintaining attention, recognition, spatial awareness. Right, so this is a chart putting all that together. Now we also have these basal nuclei. You may say, well, I've never heard of this. And a lot of people don't even know this exists in the brain. Deep within the cerebral hemisphere. Notice it's still in the section of the cerebrum. Cluster of neuron cell bodies. Neuron cell bodies. So what does that mean? What is the first thing that should pop into your mind? Cell bodies, unmyelinated. Cluster of neuron cell bodies involved in movement. Now, another part of the brain involved in movement. Notice how movement uses multiple parts of the brain. We already talked about the premotor cortex in the cerebrum. This is another part of your brain that is involved in movement, and it's separated from the diencephalon by a region of white matter. What makes up the basal nuclei is the caudate nuclei, these C-shaped rings of gray matter. And then you have this putamen, posterior and inferior to caudate nucleus, connected to caudate nucleus by small bridges. And then we have this globus pallidus, contains more myelinated fibers than other regions, okay? But it's involved in movement, basal nuclei, and it's deep within the cerebral hemisphere. So you'll see that structure there. And that one can be sometimes tricky to recognize, even when you're dissecting the brain. It can be very tricky to recognize the basal nuclei. but it's very important. So we're going to come back to that. We're going to talk about that. All right, then we have the cerebrum white matter. We were talking about the gray matter, which is the cortex. Then we have also the white matter, which contains commissural fibers. They connect the right and left hemispheres. Remember I said your right and left hemispheres, even though we have this longitudinal fissure down the center of our brain, the right and left hemispheres are connected. And so you have these commissural fibers, which connect the right and left hemispheres. The corpus callosum, largest of the four groups in the category, in the middle of the brain, at the base of longitudinal fissure. You also have projection fibers, which connect your cerebral cortex of one hemisphere with other areas of the same hemisphere. So we have connections across hemispheres, and we have connections within each hemisphere, and also other parts of brain and spinal cord. We'll see this term corona radiata, fibers spread out in radiating pattern, condense around the diencephalon. We'll see that plays a role. And then we also have association fibers, restricted to single hemisphere, connect gray matter of cortical gyri with one another. Right. So look at this. So you have fibers. Your commissural fibers connect one side of your brain to the other side, right? Very important. Then we also have association fibers, which connect different parts of one side of the brain to other parts of the brain and the spinal cord, and through the spinal cord. And then we also have these projection, association. No, sorry, that's projection fibers. Association fibers then connect the same side of the brain with parts of the same side of the brain. Okay. So there's a lot of connection. That's the idea. Commissural fibers connect right and left hemispheres. Projection fibers connect one hemisphere to other parts of the brain. And then association fibers connect same side of the brain. So that brings us to what we call the cerebrum limbic system. Possible pathway for information transferred by conduction of action potential from one region of brain to another. Right? So the brain, from that last diagram that I showed you, very simply, the brain is very, very connected. So an action potential could potentially originate in the gray matter, in the cerebral cortex of one side of your brain. That action potential can be sent to another area of gray matter by projection fibers. So projection fibers, right, could be sent to another area of gray matter. Down, up on this side, whatever. New action potential generated by gray matter spreads to neighboring gray matter by association fibers. Association fibers connected from one side to the same, on the same hemisphere, different part of the brain. Third action potential generated can be sent to other cerebral hemisphere by commissural fibers. So these fibers, the blue ones, could send that same another action potential all the way across. So you can have an action potential start here, come down, come back up here, then be sent over here, then be sent over here. So a lot of parts of your brain can connect. And that's just showing you the diagram, what we just talked about. So the limbic system is an important function of the brain. Includes limbic lobe, which is the region of the medial cerebrum, hippocampus, amygdala, and pathways. This is found only in mammalian brains. This is why human beings and other mammals are so smart, because we have this ability for our brain to communicate super fast, first of all, white matter, super fast, but communicate different parts of the brain. So, okay, this part remembers something, it communicates it to that part, which communicates it to that part. So I smell something. It smells like it's burning. My brain processes it. So you smell something, then it sends it to this side. Okay, that smells like it's burning. Then it sends it to this. What should I do if something's burning? I remember from when I was a child, 30 years ago, stop, drop, and roll. Then send me a motor signal down to my muscles, and I make the motion. We can do that as human beings. We remember something from 20 years ago and can enact it today. We have things like memory. We can learn how to stop, drop, and roll. We can learn how to respond when something's on fire, all because of the way our brains work. So the limbic system is just the ability of our brain to be able to communicate with other parts of the brain. All right, so the limbic lobe forms a ring on the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere, containing two main gyri. We have the hippocampus also involved in the temporal lobe. It's connected to the prominent C-shaped ring of white matter. And then we have the amygdala anterior to the hippocampus, involved in behavior, expression of emotion, and especially fear. They all help make up this connection of the limbic lobe. Also, these different pathways that we talked about, projection fibers, association fibers, commissural fibers, okay? All in the white matter connecting different sections. All right, so that's your limbic cerebrum limbic system. Right, help your brain stay connected with itself. They used to say I used to work at a Johnson & Johnson. They used to say if only Johnson & Johnson knew what Johnson & Johnson knew. We had 100,000 employees, and one of the hardest things to keep track of was who specialized in what. So often we would, have somebody, we would bring in somebody from the outside to work on something and then find out, oh, there was somebody in one of the 100 Johnson & Johnson companies that was an expert in that particular field that we could have had come work on this project instead of hiring like an outside consultant. And so I remember that. And your brain works the same way. And they say we don't even use the full capacity of our brain, but your brain is amazing because, it can pull, okay, put this in a file shelf over here until 20 years later. And this smell, this sight, this touch sparks this memory, which sparks this action. And, my brain can communicate with itself to figure these things out. It's amazing. Okay. Now let's go into the next section of the brain, the diencephalon. It's at the center of the brain, 4 components: the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, subthalamus. Thalamus is the main entry route of sensory data into your cerebral cortex. Looks like 2 little eggs, about 80% of the diencephalon. The third ventricle is between these 2 regions. Thalamic nuclei, remember the nuclei, receive afferent fibers from many other regions of the nervous system, but not sense of smell. Regulates cortical activity by controlling which input should continue to the cerebral cortex. So information gets to the thalamus, helps decide which information will keep on to the cerebral cortex. Remember, that's where that's where your interneurons are. A lot of processing happens. Each half of the thalamus has 3 main groups of nuclei separated by thin layers of white matter. And these nuclei function as a relay station. Receive input, integrate information, send that information to specific motor or sensory areas of your cortex. All right, so that's your thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus. Goes right into your brain stem. Notice if we look at it from a different direction, we see the pineal gland, the third ventricle. All right, so different parts will do different things. All right, so receives association nuclei of the thalamus, receives input from a variety of sources, process information related to emotions, memory, integrations of sensory information. Sends to association areas of your cerebral cortex. So sends that information to the different parts of the cerebral cortex, which we've already discussed. Non-specific nuclei receive information from basal nuclei. We talked about that, cerebellum and motor cortex. Also can send information to a wide range of locations involved in controlling arousal, consciousness, level of responsiveness. Your hypothalamus. You probably have heard of this. It's a collection of nuclei, which is, remember, nuclei is, I'll put this reminder in here, bunches of nerve cell bodies. Bunches of nerve cell bodies. That's what makes up a nuclei. It means they're unmyelinated. The hypothalamus anterior and inferior to the thalamus. Hypo, less than. Right? Neurons perform several vital functions. We're going to talk about the hypothalamus a lot when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, your sleep-wake cycle, thirst and hunger, body temperature. We have what we call this inferior hypothalamus. You may not have heard of this, anatomically and functionally linked to the pituitary gland. And that's going to get us involved in the endocrine system. Hypothalamus tissue makes up posterior portion of this endocrine gland. The hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones, which affect function of the pituitary gland. And that's the pituitary gland plays a huge role, like I said, in our endocrine system. In turn, the pituitary gland secretes hormones that affect activities of other endocrine glands throughout the body. So the pituitary gland controls, hypothalamus helps control the pituitary, which helps control a lot of other endocrine glands in the body. You do have hypothalamic hormones that do not affect the pituitary gland, which is the antidiuretic. Anytime you see diuretic, think water. It's an effect on your water balance, and oxytocin, stimulation of uterine contraction during childbirth. A little bit more about the hypothalamus. These mammillary bodies connect the hypothalamus with the limbic system. Limbic system, remember, that's the ability of your brain to connect different parts of your brain, receives input from the hippocampus, so memory, regulation, and behavior. Also receives input from outside the nervous system, endocrine system, provides information that can detect changes in your body, osmotic concentration of your blood. So it's going to play some huge roles in homeostasis. It's affecting your temperature and your blood concentrations. Then we have the epithalamus, superior to the thalamus. Most of its post-sterol superior bulk is the pineal gland, which is an endocrine gland, secretes melatonin. That helps us with our sleep-wake cycle. Remember, melatonin is not melanin, which colors our skin, chapter 5. Melatonin helps in our sleep-wake cycle. And then we also have the subthalamus, which is inferior to the thalamus. And that's functionally connected with the basal nuclei and help control movement. And those are those structures from a different angle. And they're continuous with the brain stem, as you see. But before we get to the brain stem, we want to get to the cerebellum, posterior and inferior portion of the brain, functionally connected with the cerebral cortex. Notice that again, basal nuclei, brain stem, and spinal cord, connected to all of them. Right? Helps interactions between those regions to help coordinate movement. So we've seen a lot of parts, cerebral cortex, basal nuclei, thalamus, also all working together for movement. Right? Divided into two cerebral hemispheres, very similar to the cerebrum. Cerebellar hemispheres, very similar to the cerebrum, connected by vermis. Has ridges, cover exterior cerebral surface, separated by shallow sulci, increases surface area, just like the cerebrum. We divide the cerebellum into 3 lobes, anterior, posterior, and floculonodular. Say that 3 times fast. The cerebellar cortex very similar to the cerebrum. Outer layer of gray matter, extremely folded, and then branching white matter resembles tree branches. Inner white matter contains clusters of gray matter. So you have these deep cerebellar nuclei scattered throughout on the inside. And you have the white matter converges into three large tracts, cerebellar penduncles. And that connects your cerebellum with your brainstem. And so that's your cerebellum. See the firmus, anterior lobe, posterior lobe. Okay, cerebellar penduncles. This is your brainstem and diencephalon here. They're connected. So it looks like from a different angle, different view, anterior view. Okay. And this is another view, parasagittal section. See the brainstem here, going right into your spinal cord, cerebellum, posterior. Okay. Now we have the brainstem. One of the oldest components of the brain. They believe this develops very early on in the embryo. Vital to immediate survival. You have to have this. Right? Nuclei. Remember nuclei? Cell bodies. Basic homeostatic functions, heart rate, breathing rhythm, right? Your heart has to keep beating. You have to continue breathing. So that's why this makes this, not that other parts of your brain are not important. They very much are, but your brainstem is extremely important to your homeostasis. And other parts of your brain work with your homeostasis as well. But the brainstem's very specifically. Also reflexes, movement. Again, we have movement, sensation, maintaining alertness. And so you see overlap between different sections of the brain. Brainstem is inferior to the diencephalon, anterior to the cerebellum, anterior towards the front, inferior beneath, superior to the spinal cord, just above the spinal cord on the mid-sagittal section of the brain, extends to level of foramen magnum along with the fourth ventricle, continues with the spinal cord and central canal. All right, this is our brainstem. So we talk about the cerebrum, big section here, your cerebellum back here, fourth ventricle space here, and this is your brainstem here, which looks, some people sometimes get it confused with the spinal cord because it looks like just part of the spinal cord, but it's different. And it's separated into sections, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Okay. Diencephalon here in the middle. All right, that's another, and that's looking at a cadaver. All right, so the brainstem we divide into superior, midbrain. In the middle, we have the pons, and inferior, we have the medulla oblongata. So that's going from superior to inferior. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Right? Fibers of the cerebellum and related nuclei. Nuclei, cell bodies, travel through portions of the brainstem, synapse with nuclei there or progress on to other destinations in the cerebral cortex or spinal cord. So connection between the cerebellum through the brainstem to the cerebral cortex or through the brainstem down to the spinal cord. Nuclei of reticular formation, which is a group of connected nuclei scattered throughout the brainstem. Many functions, respiration, we talked about that, breathing, blood pressure, sleep-wake cycle. Again, we see that, pain perception and consciousness. Right? The brainstem has tracts of white matter between spinal cord and brain. Nearly all pathways to and from brain and spinal cord travel through your brainstem, which makes sense. Brainstem looks like a continuation of the spinal cord. So things coming from your spinal cord travel through the brainstem. So your tracts of white tracts, remember, myelinated axons travel through the brainstem. You also have cranial nerve nuclei. Many cranial nerves originate in brainstem. Nuclei have many sensory, motor, autonomic responsibilities. Looking at the brainstem, you see the diencephalon. We talked about that part of the brain. That's technically separate from the brainstem. Then we get to the brainstem, we get here, the midbrain, the pons, medulla oblongata, and what the different sections have to deal with. All right, so your midbrain, directly inferior to your diencephalon, surrounds your cerebral aqueduct, also known as mesencephalon, shortest and most superior brainstem region. So at the top of the brainstem, right, inferior to the diencephalon. What does it do? That section of the brain, superior and inferior colliculi, protrude from posterior surface of the brainstem. Visual and auditory functions respectively, and they project to the thalamus. You have these descending tracts, these white matter tracts. Remember, tracts are collections of myelinated axons originating cerebrum, form anterior most portion of midbrain, substantia nigra, darkly pigmented region. Neurons work with basal nuclei to control movement. See that movement again? You have these red nucleus posterior to substantia nigra, communicates with cerebellum, spinal cord, other regions, regulating movement. Once again, many cranial nerve nuclei, so soma cell bodies for the cranial nerves. Remember, cranial nerves don't go through the spinal cord. They're in the midbrain. And then here at the bottom midbrain, tegmentum, region of midbrain between cerebral aqueduct, substantia nigra, contains numerous nuclei. Many are components of this reticular formation, which we'll talk about in more detail. Ascending and descending white matter tracts are also in this region. It's all in the midbrain. After the midbrain, we get to the pons. Prominent anterior surface contains descending motor tracts. Motor, once again, tracts, myelinated axons, descending motor tracts from crus cerebri. Some pass through pons and route to the spinal cord. Others enter the cerebellum by way of middle cerebellar peduncle. Reticular formation and cranial nerve nuclei are posterior to these tracts. And then at the bottom here, the pontine nuclei rules. You have these regulation of movement, once again, breathing, reflexes, complex function associated with sleep and arousal in the pons. So see some overlap there. And then we have the medulla oblongata, the last section, the most inferior section of the brain stem. Continues with the spinal cord, so looks like it goes right into the spinal cord. Contain upper motor neuron fibers of the corticospinal tract, traveling from cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Right and left corticospinal fibers dissociate, cross over, right? So this is why the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. It's where they cross over, is right here in the medulla oblongata. You have posterior columns, paired tracts of white matter on the medulla's posterior surface, carry sensory information from the spinal cord. Posterior columns also dissociate within medulla. So sensory information from your right side of your spinal cord processed by the left side of cerebral cortex and vice versa. So motor information switches over here. So the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. And then the reverse happens with sensory information switches over here. So sensory information from your right side goes to your left side of your brain and vice versa. Several cranial nerve and reticular formation nuclei are in the medulla as well. Okay, medulla oblongata. All right, locked-in syndrome. We always try to apply some of the things that we've learned in this class to real life. Caused by damage to motor tracts of the pons. Cerebral cortex is unable to communicate with the spinal cord. And what happens? No purposeful movement is possible. Also, sensory pathways to brain remain intact, right? So they can't move, but they can sense things. Patients are literally locked in their bodies, yet fully aware of everything going on. We may say paralyzed, but they realize everything that's happening. Some can communicate using eye movements controlled by the brain, midbrain. All right, so it's like you're paralyzed, but you're well aware of what's happening. Damage to the motor tracts. So locked-in syndrome, scary stuff. I've heard of this happening to somebody when they were having surgery, and they could feel everything going on, but couldn't express that they were feeling the pain. Scary stuff if that happens. Right, and then we have the reticular formation, last part, one of the most complex regions of the brain. You probably have heard this, you may have heard this before, may have heard this mentioned. It's a collection of over 100 nuclei, remember nuclei, cell bodies, in a central core of 3 brainstem subdivisions. So input is received from multiple sources: the cerebral cortex, remember that's the outer portion of your cerebrum, your limbic system, which connects different parts of your brain, and sensory stimuli. Output is sent throughout entire brain and spinal cord. So this reticular formation, these 100 nuclei in central core of your brain stem, receives input from different parts of your brain, sensory stimuli, and then sends information throughout entire brain and spinal cord. And it's showing you that there, these 100 nuclei, cell bodies, in the center of your brain stem. Reticular formation. It's a big picture, putting it all kind of together. Your cerebral cortex, your cerebellum, your brainstem, your diencephalon, your basal nuclei, putting it all together. Their major functions in a chart. There's definitely, like I said before, you'll see some overlap in the functions.